Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Health Matters, where we'll be talking about summer health. I'm nutritionist and naturopathic doctoral candidate Erica Robinson, and I'll be your host this evening. We've got two great guests coming on the show to talk to us about staying healthy and staying safe throughout the summer. First, we'll be joined by Tyler Reitzma to talk about head injury awareness and prevention, followed in the second half of the show by Jacinda Martin to talk about eating healthy in the summer, including local and organic foods. Joining us first is Tyler Reitzma. He's a case manager at the Peel Halton Dufferin Acquired Brain Injury Services. Tyler holds an undergraduate degree in psychology with a focus on neuroscience. So welcome to the show, Tyler.
Thank you, Erica.
So it's a special month right now.
It is.
It's the National Brain Injury Awareness Month. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Well, it's essentially just a campaign in order to help people become a little bit more aware of head injuries, their prevention, their incidence, and what things people can do in order to be able to prevent them.
Okay, so are there any special events going on right now around that?
At the moment, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure. It's still early in the month, so I'm sure it's on a lot of calendars, and there are a lot of awareness campaigns being put on by a lot of hospitals and clinics and whatnot.
Okay, and perhaps you can get into this too. I mean, head injuries are quite prevalent right now in the news.
They are, absolutely. It's generally a pretty hot topic overall, and anyone who reads Maclean's magazine recent issue had the concussions as one of the major topics of discussion in the magazine.
Really?
And anyone who follows sports, just on Monday night, the Game 3 of the Stanley Cup Final, there was a rather devastating hit on Nathan Horton, where a player had essentially body checked him and targeted his head. He went down. And as a result, there's a lot of wondering as to whether or not he sustained a rather severe head injury or not.
Really?
So it is a rather prevalent topic right now.
So let's delve into a little bit about what concussions are, because we are seeing them in sports more, and in summertime coming up, more sports are being played. So what is a concussion exactly? What's going on there?
With a concussion, what happens is that there is an impact, essentially. You have some sort of impact external to the body that is causing some sort of damage to the brain that isn't causing something that shows up on a CT scan. So you have something that once somebody goes into the hospital and gets looked at through a CT scan, the doctor looks at it and says, well, there's nothing too major here, so it's either diagnosed as a mild traumatic brain injury or a concussion. The two terms are used interchangeably. They're relatively similar in terms of how often people use them, but essentially what a concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury.
Really? So you're actually sustaining damage to the brain?
Absolutely.
So what are the effects of this, both short and long term?
In the short term, you see a lot of nausea, confusion, dizziness, fatigue, inconsistent memory in terms of orientation to time or day.
Okay, so are those some things to look for then when somebody has a concussion?
Absolutely. Those are the things that come up more often, I think. When you see somebody that sustains one, especially in a sporting event, they'll appear dazed, they won't really know what's going on, and they'll have difficulty either holding their hands straight. You'll see their hands shaking sometimes as well.
Getting a bit shaky.
Exactly. So there are a lot of different symptoms that you can look for.
And now, do you know personally if they go undiagnosed or if they go missed because of the fact that they're not showing up sometimes on the CT scans?
Well, that's one of the things that concussions, it's not so much that they miss them when they go to the hospital, it's that often people don't go to the hospital because they don't realize that anything has happened. So concussions are often underreported simply because you're playing sports, and if you get hit, you get a little bit disoriented, you go off to the side of the bench, and depending on the level of competitiveness in which you're playing, those kinds of symptoms are something that just gets easily toughed out. So you'll see in a lot of rec leagues, the coaches will say, tough it out, or other players, and that's just the way that sports work often, so that you don't really realize that something serious has happened.
Right. I mean, do coaches have any training in how to recognize this?
Traditionally, no, but I can't speak to most sports because I'm not a coach, but I can say that as of the fact that it's becoming a lot more of a hot topic, a lot of coaches and trainers and doctors are starting to become a lot more involved in being able to diagnose and recognize those early warning signs.
Right. So tell us then, what's the problem if we fail to take ourselves or our children to the hospital if we've got a concussion and we don't recognize it?
Well, there are a lot of long-term complications in terms of not noticing whether or not those kinds of things are occurring, simply because there's damage that you are essentially having undiagnosed. So if you've had one or more concussions, the more concussions you have, you start to have a lot more damage to the brain. You have a lot more complications. I mean, the Maclean's article that was just recently out talks about Eric Lindros, who I believe sustained 8 over the course of his career.
Wow.
And he's experiencing a lot of difficulties with that. And along with the CTE, where you see with Bob Probert, with a lot more of the news going on because he donated his brain, so there's a lot more information with that as well.
Really? So what's that showing us then with the donation?
Well, it's showing that Probert was a bit of a tough guy. He was a lot more of an active hockey player in terms of fights and in terms of hits, and the damage that he sustained caused a lot of long-term complications in terms of his cognitive abilities, emotional lability, and in the end, it was a lot more complicated than it needed to be because of the injuries that he had sustained.
And I mean, did he know as he was going through that he was having all of these concussions, or is it something that he only found out afterwards or after he died?
Well, after he died, certainly it's when we were able to see a lot more of the damage that had been sustained.
Right.
But with the actual damage, you don't actually get to see it, or you weren't able to see it as much in the earlier times because the technology hadn't existed then.
So let's touch on that. We have new technology now, so how is that impacting things?
It's a big part of what we're doing, actually, with concussions and with brain injuries in general. They went undiagnosed a lot in earlier days because we didn't have the technology to be able to see what was going on inside the brain until someone had actually died. So, and since the introduction of CTs and MRIs, you're able to see a lot more of the functioning of the brain and a lot more in detail what is exactly going on, which allows for a more accurate diagnosis.
So, what are they using, MRIs and CT scans?
Depending on the situation, usually a CT because it's easier, it's a lot faster, it's a lot less specific of a test. So MRIs are a lot more expensive in terms of the cost of the healthcare system, and the wait lists are really, really long.
Right.
So usually a CT scan will be the first thing that you'll do, and if nothing serious turns up, and in the case of concussions, there isn't usually any other reason to further go into an MRI.
Right.
They'll look at the brain and say, okay, well there's no major damage, there's no hemorrhaging, there's no bleeding, and that's when they'll give the diagnosis of a mild traumatic brain injury.
And then at that point, what typically is the treatment? Do you know what people have to do once they find out they have a concussion?
Rest. In every possible way. That's probably the best way to go in terms of concussions. You talk about physical and mental rest. So usually once someone has sustained a concussion, you try and give them a little bit of a physical break so that they're not participating in sports for some time, and then slowly build them back into the exercise regimen. And with the mental rest, you try to stay away from more cognitively stimulating activities.
Oh, really? So that's important as well.
Absolutely, because when you have an injury to the brain, that's another aspect of where an injury occurs. If you pull a muscle, you don't go right back out and try and run a quarter mile.
Exactly.
You take a rest and you try and relax it a little bit and slowly build yourself back into sprinting again.
Right. Yeah. So typically, how long should people take off of sports if they've sustained one?
That's something that's usually up to an individual basis, simply because anytime someone sustains something, you have to try and figure out exactly what's wrong with that person. So it's basically on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. And then the other question I had is, what's the long-term implication of the damage that's occurring with repeated concussions?
With repeated concussions, that's something that you're seeing a lot with, for example, the Probert, or with Eric Lindros. You have a lot of long-term cognitive disabilities. You have a lot of emotional lability. You have a lot of difficulties with cognitive processing that occur because of the fact that these repeated blows to the brain are slowing your response times and changing the way that your brain works.
So do you have any concrete examples of what people might see in their loved ones who've gone through this? Like, are they unable to calculate numbers? Do they have trouble recalling names? Anything like that?
All of those examples are things that can happen. You have just general cognitive slowing. You have difficulty with problem solving, say remembering your daily schedule, forgetting things, putting things in the wrong places. Difficulty with multitasking or with understanding things that are going on, longer sentences. So the different cognitive sequelae are something that you see a lot of deficits in with people that have had these kinds of injuries or prolonged injuries.
Anything on the physical level?
Absolutely, as well with Muhammad Ali, another example of someone who has
sustained. He's a great example.
Yeah, he's someone who has spent his entire life taking blows to the head, essentially. So he's a great example there because his Parkinsonian symptom is a post-traumatic one. So post-traumatic Parkinsonian syndrome is because of the repeated blows to the head, he now has all of those physical tremors and whatnot that look exactly like Parkinson's because they are, but it's not because of any genetic or anything else, it's because of the injuries that he's sustained.
So it appears that he has Parkinson's, but he didn't get it in the traditional way, he simply got it from all these blows to the head.
Absolutely, yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. And what should we be looking for, or at what point should we be taking our loved ones to the hospital if we suspect they've sustained a concussion over the summer during their sports?
As soon as you suspect that it might have happened, My personal suggestion would be to absolutely go. I mean, you can never be too careful with those kinds of
Better
things.
safe than sorry kind of thing?
Exactly. You can never be too careful when it comes to your brain.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you have a child that was in the middle of a game and took a blow to the head or fell down and landed awkwardly or came back up and felt a little bit confused or dizzy or nauseous or had a bit of the shakes or wasn't able to answer basic questions, a lot of the coaches in minor league sports now do have a specific list of questions that they will ask.
Really?
Yeah. So they'll have something that they'll be able to ask them to go through to figure out whether or not they've sustained a concussion or not, or whether or not at least that they're displaying some of the symptoms that are consistent with concussion.
Right. So is there anything that a parent can ask their child if something happens and there's no coach around or it wasn't a sporting event?
Immediately after, one of the things that you can keep asking them is just basic memory questions or relevance questions to what's going on. Asking them, what team do you play for? Where do you live? Do you remember your name, parents? Do you remember what happened last week in our game last week? Do you remember what team we played? Do you remember what the score was? Did we win? Did we lose? Questions like that to make sure that they're still consistently oriented to the various facts that have happened recently. And if they show any sort of confusion or difficulty answering the questions or any other difficulties really with that, then that's something that is a little bit of a red flag in terms of whether or not they've sustained something at least.
So essentially any questions that require a considerable amount of cognition at least.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. And to the doctors or to the emergency room?
I would say the emergency room, just because you can never really be too careful in terms of whether or not it was a regular injury, whether or not it was a concussion, or whether or not there may be something even more serious going on.
Right.
So those are things that you can't really diagnose on a sideline.
That's
so if you have any sort of inkling as to whether or not something has happened, then that's definitely something you want to take care of as soon as you can.
So I definitely think then better be safe than sorry. So if you suspect it, going to the hospital is probably the best action to do.
Yep.
Right. Now, we only have 1 minute until we head to the break, but can you tell us briefly some other types of injuries that we can discuss when we get back that happen to the brain? Aside from concussions, obviously.
Well, aside from concussions, I mean, there are obviously some more intense injuries that you can suffer. So in terms of, say, if you're riding a bike and get involved in some sort of motor vehicle accident, more serious injuries can occur. And that's one of the things I wanted to touch on as well, is just the use of helmets or personal protective equipment in terms of your basic day-to-day life, especially going into the summer when people tend to ride more bikes.
Well, that's just it. There's a lot more activities going on in the summer. People are more active, more physically active, more sports, more swimming and things like that. So I think when we get back, we'll definitely touch on that in quite a bit more detail. But yes, anything else aside from the helmets?
Well, in terms of, I mean, mouth guards are always good as well, but research is kind of inconclusive, I guess you could say, with regards to impact absorption.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll talk more about that when we get back from the break.
All right.
Perfect. Welcome back to Health Matters, where we're talking about summer health. Particularly right now, we're focusing on summer safety. We're meeting with Tyler Wrights, my case manager, to discuss head injury prevention. So Tyler, we touched briefly before we left on bikes and bike helmets. So a lot of people are biking now that it's summertime. Can you tell us about anything anything that we can run into risk-wise if we don't wear a helmet?
There's an entire list of things that you can run into if you're not wearing a helmet, specifically like running into curbs or cars even.
Right.
So when you're riding a bicycle, obviously you want to be wearing a helmet. You need to be protecting your head in the same way that you wear a seatbelt when you're driving, because it's not so much your skill or what it is that you're doing, but there are any number of things that can happen while you're in control of your bicycle that can happen to you that can cause you to fall off your bike and potentially hit your head.
Right.
The research exists that shows that bicycle helmets prevent brain injuries at an incredible rate.
Really?
Yeah, and yet people aren't wearing helmets. I can think of any time that I'm driving around in Toronto. You see people riding around without helmets all the time.
That's right.
Yeah, the rates are relatively low in terms of wearing helmets in and around the city in Ontario.
So really, they are pretty low?
They are. I believe, let's see here, 77% in Nova Scotia, where the legislation is across. But then you have, in Ontario, where legislation only applies to people under the age of 18,
Okay.
you have 40.6% of people that are wearing, as opposed to the rates that are far higher in other
Right.
provinces where the legislation exists right across the board.
Really? So Ontario's rare in that we only enforce it until the age of 18.
That's right. That's right. So it's not only is it rare, it also shows that people aren't wearing their helmets as soon as they get past that legislation. So any
Right.
adults over the age of 18, they tend to not be wearing their helmets.
And that's probably setting a bad example for kids too.
And that's exactly what the statistics are showing. I mean, helmet use is relatively low across the board in places where no legislation exists. In Ontario, where we have the essentially two-tiered level, where you're required to wear a helmet until the age of 18, and then past that, you're not. You still have lower levels of responding. You have more people under that age that are wearing helmets a regular portion of the time, but then the rates past that, when you become an adult, they tend to take it off, and then they don't tend to wear it anymore. Whereas when you have other places where you have across-the-board legislation where helmets are mandatory, regardless of how old you are, you have higher rates of helmet wearing, both in adults and in the children as well.
Well, 77% compared to 40 is quite a huge difference.
Yeah, it's a big difference, yeah.
I mean, it's such a simple thing too to prevent injury, but we're not doing it.
Yeah, and it also shows that adults are setting that kind of example. That when you have
That's right.
adults that are always wearing helmets, and everyone that rides a bike is required to wear a helmet, you have higher rates of children wearing helmets as well, simply because that's what everyone else is doing on top of that.
Right, it just looks normal.
Exactly. It's not something that you really think about as much because it's what everyone else is doing. Whereas when you're here in Ontario, where the legislation is a little bit differently, the kids aren't wearing it
Not the
as often.
case.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I guess the message being at home, if you're a parent, try to set the good example. Even if you're not a parent, set the good example for the kids.
Exactly. Wear your helmet. It's not only just setting an example for children, but it's also the safer thing to do to begin with.
Right.
Because if you get cut off while you're riding your bike on the side of the road, a driver doesn't see you and turns, you're going end over end. Where
That's
if you're
right.
wearing a helmet, you could prevent a very potentially serious injury.
That's right, and I can't even count the number of times that I've been careful, but somebody is driving recklessly or poorly or making poor decisions, and I've almost been hit, and I wear a helmet. But that risk is always there, like you said. It's not just our skill, it's who else is on the road, right?
Exactly. And that happens on the ski hill as well. It happens everywhere.
Right.
So regardless of what sport you're playing or what activity that you're taking part in, that risk always exists. So
Right.
wearing whatever personal protective equipment that exists is always a good idea. So whether you're riding a bike or whether you're on the ski hill, it doesn't matter how good you are. If somebody flies down the hill, hits a bump, and takes a tumble in front of you,
Exactly.
even if you're a professional skier, if
You're
he takes
still
out
going
your
to get
skis,
hurt.
you're going to get injured. Exactly.
Right, so protecting yourself from other people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I had to do an assignment in a public health course in med school, and there was a really interesting perspective that someone raised, and that was that where he was from, statistically, if there was forced helmet usage, there was decreased ridership of bikes. So that meant then that there was implications for obesity, diabetes, and things like that, because less people were riding their bikes because they couldn't afford a helmet, whatever might be the case.
Right.
What's your opinion on that whole thing?
Well, in This particular article that I'm looking at right now is in Injury Prevention in 2010. They did look at usage of bicycles before and after the implementation of legislation in both PEI and Alberta.
Okay.
And they found that recreational and commuting bicycle use remained unchanged among both youth and adults.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, so the research, at least in those particular areas, showed that with the introduction of the mandatory legislation of wearing your helmets all the time, it didn't actually change the level of ridership.
Well, that's a good
frequency,
thing then, because we do want to keep a more holistic view of how is this going to affect the whole body and the whole population.
Absolutely.
Is there any push in Ontario for enforcing helmet usage after the age of 18? Are people lobbying for that?
I think there's always been a lobby for it. There's always people who have been saying that helmets need to be worn in terms of the medical community, the brain injury community. There's always been a push for increased legislation in terms of making sure that people are following the rules that are currently in existence, as well as furthering them to mirror the provinces that do actually show the same statistics and have shown the benefits.
Well, I think if we've got those stats from Canadian provinces and ridership isn't decreasing, it's definitely, I think, a good idea. But yeah, the other thing that I wanted to touch on, you've got a neuroscience background. I also did a lot of neuroscience in undergrad. A lot of the really unique things that we learned about injuries to the brain and their effects, my professors would comment that research came from people in motorcycle accidents. So we see a lot of really sort of freaky, for lack of a better word, effects happening to these people in particularly, which just points to the fact that there's a lot of accidents coming from motorcycle injuries. So can you tell us a bit about that and what's going on there?
Well, when it comes to motorcycle injuries, I think that you tend to see a lot more diverse results simply because there's a lot more damage, I guess. There's a lot more variability because of the fact that someone who's riding a motorcycle, if they get into a motor vehicle accident, there are all number of forces that can be existing right there, and when they get hit, they're what they bounce off of. They're not strapped into their particular vehicle, so there are any number of different things that can happen to the person at that time. So with motorcycles, I think you do see a lot more of a variability in terms of what kinds of injuries can occur, simply because of the nature of a motorcycle.
Right. I mean, you're at a much higher velocity than on a bike, right? And you're probably on a highway, which you would never do with a regular bike. So,
right.
Yeah. Are there people that actually ride motorcycles without helmets? Have you ever seen this happen?
Anyone who's, again, to bring it back to sports, anyone who's familiar with sports will remember the Ben Roethlisberger incident. It happened a few years back, where there are states in the United States that still haven't gotten on the train of making mandatory helmet use an actual legal issue. And being a football player, you would think that he would know to wear a helmet while riding a motorcycle, since he has to wear one every day for when he's playing the game. But he wasn't wearing a helmet and got into an accident and kind of flew through another vehicle. So there are times where people don't wear helmets, and it's one of those things that just doesn't seem to make sense. But the legislation in Canada, luckily, is that you have to wear a helmet regardless of what the situation is.
And there is definitely, now that the summer weather is coming, more people on their motorcycles. But can we still sustain a considerable amount of damage even when wearing the helmet?
You certainly can. Yeah, you do see that with anything, really. What the helmet does is it just prevents further damage, or it lessens any potential damage that could happen.
Right.
So just like I think there's a program that happens in Hamilton right now through Hamilton Health Sciences. They're doing the blades, bikes, and something or other.
I've heard of that.
I'm sorry, the name's escaping me right now. But where they show a cauliflower and they drop it, and then they put a cauliflower in a helmet and drop it, and they show the difference in terms of the damage. Obviously, if you throw it a little bit harder, the damage will still occur, but it's certainly less than if you weren't wearing one at all.
Right.
So it's one of those things that just prevents further damage from happening.
Yeah.
So it doesn't save you completely, but it will certainly prevent any minor damage from happening if there's something happens. It's the best way to go.
So, I mean, should we be taking our chances, or do you think that people shouldn't be riding motorcycles?
Well, I can't really comment on that. I think motorcycles are just a regular mode of transportation. I'll know a lot of people enjoy them, and a lot of people ride them all the time. So, in terms of their legality as an actual recreational vehicle or a vehicle in general, I think that they're fine right now. It is difficult to say. I mean, I personally don't ride one. And that's simply because you see all of the results and the potential for damage.
Right.
But you can only go so far, I think, in terms of restricting people's usage of those particular vehicles.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I want to touch on, too, which particular sports or activities in the summertime, but all around the year, are more, there's more risk of acquiring a brain injury from?
Well, as you would expect, football tends to be the most of any sport in terms of injuries. I believe the concussion rates in high school sports, the injury rate per 1,000 athlete exposures is almost 1 per 1,000 in terms of football. But then the next ones are hockey, soccer, surprisingly.
Really?
and
Soccer?
lacrosse. Soccer, yeah. The girls' soccer actually has a higher rate of concussion incidents than boys' basketball, boys' soccer, and wrestling even.
Girls soccer?
Yeah.
Do we know why? What's
That's-
going on there?
Not entirely sure. Well, one of the theories is that women tend to have slightly less neck muscle development
Okay.
and slightly less head mass, so that just happens to correlate a little bit more with more concussion rate.
Okay, so soccer, lacrosse. Lacrosse is another interesting one that I wouldn't think of. Is that, like, what kinds of injuries are we seeing there?
Well, lacrosse is a lot more of a contact sport as well, so you do
Okay.
see just a lot of various injuries, but you do have a lot of hitting as well, so people do
Right.
end up with concussions there as well. But the main ones are football and hockey.
Right, so people should probably be more careful when playing these sports.
Absolutely, and one should always be aware of the potential for injury in those sports and just making sure that you're doing everything you can in order to prevent it. Obviously, playing the sport is risky in and of itself.
Right.
But if you're playing safe and you're making sure that you're not trying to going in with the intent to harm,
Mm-hmm.
then you're putting the best foot forward. You're trying to play at least with the best intentions.
That's right.
Yeah.
And another thing too, we're seeing a lot more swimming in the summertime. Do you know anything about injuries related to diving in the shallow end or diving off of a cliff and hitting rocks, anything like that?
Yep. All of those will result in injuries if you hit your head. The head and neck and spinal injuries are common with people who dive and land in the shallow end. So
Right.
anytime you don't know what's underneath you or you don't know how deep the water is, never dive into the water, just because it's not very smart. If you
Right.
can't see the bottom and you don't know how far away it is, then just go in normally. Go in
Right.
feet first, or do something that isn't going to result in you potentially hitting your head against a rock.
That's right. And,
Yeah.
and from my previous lifeguarding experience, I think we got about 20 deaths a year related to spinal injuries from jumping off of things into water.
Right, and it makes sense. And it's one of those things that if you can't see where you're going, it doesn't make as much sense to dive in head
Right.
first.
Right. The other thing that I'm thinking, I haven't seen any stats on it, but I'm just assuming that because the hotter weather is out, that people might be consuming alcohol more frequently just due to barbecues, outdoor events, cottaging, stuff like that. And perhaps that might result in impaired judgment. Have you seen anything like that or heard anything about it?
Absolutely, yep. And with any sports, with any motor vehicles, obviously, there's an incredible amount of research that shows that your reaction time is slowed, your judgment is impaired. And so when you're drinking, there's a much greater incidence of you potentially injuring yourself if you're trying to do something that involves motor coordination or skill. So judgment is obviously impaired when you're
Right.
drinking. So if you are drinking, try and avoid things that could end in some sort of head injury. So
Right.
drinking and driving, obviously a terrible idea, not just for yourself, but for others. And in terms of other sports and whatnot, you try and back it off.
Right, right. Thanks so much, Tyler, for joining us.
Oh,
When
no
we
problem.
get back, we'll be talking with Jacinda about eating organically. Welcome back to Health Matters, where we're talking about summer health. In the first half of the show, we discussed summer safety, particularly looking at head injury prevention from the sports that we play in the summer. But what about how do we keep active, how do we keep healthy, how do we eat healthily in the summer? Joining us next to discuss all of that is registered holistic nutritionist Jacinda Martin. Jacinda is also a chef and a teacher at Niagara College and the Canadian School of Natural Nutrition. So welcome to the show, Jacinda.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on today.
Great. I think there's two topics that I originally wanted to cover, which was organic and local eating, since those are terms that are coming more pertinent to us these days. We're seeing more of it. So can you talk to us perhaps a bit about what's going on with local and organic foods? Why are we seeing more of it now?
Sure, absolutely. I think in general, eating is supposed to be something simple. It's supposed to be something straightforward. We're supposed to be able to do it naturally. It's not supposed to be complicated.
Right.
However, the changing in our food industry, what we're doing with our foods, how it's being sprayed, how it's being grown, has really made a significant impact on now what we have to do when we look at our foods. So I think local foods have become a lot more popular because people are finding that sourcing close to home is very important, and if they can take it one step further to organic farming or organic produce, that seems to be a lot more of a trend today.
Mm-hmm.
I think the organics in itself has become a fairly large industry, just like any other industry out there. However, there are many factors about organics that are very beneficial for the consumer, for their health, ensuring that the food that they are getting has been properly grown, safely grown through standards that we do have here in Canada.
Mm-hmm. I like what you said about how it should be simple, and we've almost created a problem when it comes to eating. I mean, now it's such a huge thing. I doubt our ancestors really thought much about what they ate. They just ate, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if we look at the aisles in the grocery store today, there certainly is far more than there ever used to be, which again has had a lot of people come back to naturally grown foods, a more holistic approach to eating.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think this amount of choice is causing us to have poor nutrition choices, just being overwhelmed by choice, or what do you think? What role does that play?
Absolutely. I think people today are very busy, myself included. I have 3 boys and a very active lifestyle, and time. Time is a huge factor. So I think a lot of the food choices today are simplified and marketed for simplicity.
Right.
And I think that plays into the consumer and how we want to eat today. So it has taken away from quality. And it's more a time factor, I think. So,
right. It seems to me that the trade-off is if you don't want to spend the time or even the money, that you tend to get a lower quality food with more chemicals in it, so that it's either preserved for a long period of time and you can eat it right away, or so that it's prepared faster, cooks faster. So what problems is that presenting us?
Well, I think we're pickling ourselves to some degree. I mean, we're putting a lot of things in our foods today that, I mean, my grandparents would never have had in their foods.
Right.
I think it's also very generational. So our seniors today have never had to look at their foods like they have to look at it now. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, young people today, all of their foods, all of the things they consume for the most part have been manufactured, refined, processed, altered, food additives and preservatives. And there's a host of health issues that are going along with that, creating a lot of issues along with the foods.
What are some of the top ones, maybe the top 4 or 5 that you can think of that comes to eating all of this additive and preservative?
As far as what the foods themselves are causing in behavioral problems, a lot of allergies. There's more allergies today than any time previously historically.
I mean, is it just me, or does it seem like everyone's allergic to something now?
Well, some of the problems that lie into allergies have also been linked to the genetic modification of foods.
Right.
So now when we're eating foods that are, let's take a tomato for example, if it's been modified with a fish gene, it may not be the tomato the individual's allergic to, it's possible it may be the fish portion of that tomato that they're allergic to. So a lot of the modified foods have other foods or genes in them. And I think that's helping increase the food allergies that we're seeing today.
Wow. So what does genetically modified mean, or GMO, genetically modified organism?
Genetically modified. So that's a genetically modified organism. And what they do is they take a gene from one organism and insert it through science into another organism. And when that organism grows, it has taken on some of those gene traits. And it could be something like tolerating the heat more. It could be cold resistant, pesticide resistant, pest resistant. So all different things that are added to the food to enhance its growth period. So yielding
not
more.
To enhance our health, but rather to enhance how much of it we can produce.
Correct. So yields are supposed to be higher. The claim was that genetically modifying foods was to feed the world and help to feed the world. However, I've yet to see us feeding the world.
I've yet to see it too. I think it's more of a political problem than a shortage of food.
I would tend to agree with you there. Yeah.
Right. And the other thing I worry about too is that I'm aware that to get the gene inside of the tomato gene, I mean, a fish gene isn't naturally there. They use something like what's called a vector or a virus.
Yes, a virus or a bacteria. Virus. Yep, absolutely.
So then we're getting huge levels of this bacteria or this virus in our food, and we don't know the implications of that. We haven't studied it for a long period of time.
There's been lots of side effects and studies done, but nothing that has come out that has predominantly stood out that it would warrant them to stop genetically modifying foods. I don't think you'll see it stop. There's such a host of genetically modified foods, corn being one, soya being the number two. Now our sugar beets are on the list of genetically modifying. So lots of the foods that we're consuming do have a lot of genetically modified food products with them. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Are you aware of countries where they don't genetically modify?
There are some. But overall, globally, the companies who do genetically modify foods and sell the seeds and so on have managed to market around the globe. So globally now we're looking at many countries, India, their cotton, China, the United States, Canada. We all have a variable different number of foods that we do genetically modify and grow. Mm-hmm.
Right. And there's some other problems with that. For instance, I mean, you just said GMOs are supposed to feed the planet. However, some companies are developing seeds with genes where they never come back, like the plant dies after 1 year, so that the farmers continually have to buy new seeds.
Correct. Traditionally, farmers would sometimes keep their seeds, save seeds is what it's called, saving seeds. But a lot of the genetically modified seeds now, after 1 year, die. So therefore, you cannot reharvest. You have to purchase again and again and again. In order to grow genetically modified crops, you need to follow a protocol. Part of that protocol is a series of sprays that go with that particular seed that's being grown.
Really? So I can't imagine that being a good thing for the farmers.
Well, certainly not organic.
Right.
Definitely
not organic.
No.
So with organics, are there genetically modified foods?
No. The problem with organics is, and I say problem, but the dispute with organics is an industry. Mm-hmm. Organics is not new. We were all organic farmers originally, and since we have altered, tainted, and changed the way we grow and spray, we have now had to go back to an organic way of growing our foods. But organic foods themselves in Canada have a set of rules and regulations and guidelines to do with the soil being clean, the crop being free and being tested for so many years. I believe it's 5. Before that is deemed actually organic, and then it can have the stamp or the seal of approval as an organic farmer. Many farmers can't afford the process.
It's quite costly, right?
It is very expensive. So for a lot of farmers, they may grow fairly close to organic or raise cattle or whatever their animals are organically, but may not have the certification.
That's
right. So checking with your local farmer is really, really important, just to make sure that their growing practices or how they raise their animals practice. Most of the farmers would be more than happy to have you, visit their farm or purchase directly from them.
And I mean, we here in the Peel region, we have so many farms, not necessarily in here, but just surrounding us. We've got so many farms, and I know it's not something we normally consider, but it is quite a good thing to get to know the person that grows your food.
Absolutely. Not only do you get to know them on a personal basis, but you get to know and understand the lifestyle that goes with it, the concepts of how they grow their food. Does that fit into, what you're looking for when you buy your food, or things that are important to you? Some people are worried about how the animals are treated. So if you're concerned about, do they have enough space? Do they get fresh air? Do they get to come out of a pen? Getting to know your local farmer, that'll be definitely something that they can share with you.
Answer those questions. So another thing that you touched on was organics in Canada. So can you tell us about the fact that organics are not the same around the world?
Yeah. We have a set of standards here in Canada, fairly similar to the U.S. And in order to have a stamp or a seal on our food products, they have to follow the guidelines that we have here in Canada. The problem is countries overseas around the world that do claim to grow organically do not have the same standards that we do
Right.
here, and they're not followed up with very clearly. They're not governed the same way we are here. They don't go through the same protocol, the length of time that we have to ensure that those foods are safe. So where the problem lies is when we're importing some of those foods, the possibility of it not being as organic, if we can say that, as we would
Right.
like it to be,
Right.
could be the possibility there. So.
And I think something that a lot of people aren't aware of is that a lot of organics are coming out of countries like China. So there
Absolutely.
aren't the same stringent guidelines
No.
over there.
No, there's a lot of health issues, Indonesia, China, Thailand, with regards to food safety, food practices, growing practices, high uses of drugs, antibiotics, and so on with animal species as well as some of the foods. So the problem with that lies is we import them, label them as organic products from China, which would not follow our same standards here. So as an organic purchaser, you may want to reconsider the countries that you're purchasing
Right.
from. Doing some research on your own is important, finding out which countries really do follow those standards, and understanding what we expect here in Canada and the countries that do follow that.
And
Yeah.
are you able to tell? I mean, most times I see in the grocery store, tomatoes from Ontario, but will it say that the produce is from China or from another country?
The produce sometimes does, sometimes doesn't. From the grocery store, it depends. Often, certain grocery stores will have actual like wooden signs or signs within that produce section that say clearly where the country the food was grown in. If you go to Europe, it's very different than it is here. It's very clear
Really?
where the foods are grown. It's very clear the type of farming it was done. If it was a fish that they're purchasing, the fish came from a certain area, where it was grown, how it was grown, if it was farmed, if it was fresh.
Wow.
So there's a lot of different areas around the world of food standards, and we're certainly not all the same globally, that's for sure.
It kind of sounds like Canada's not yet up to par.
We're not yet up to par. We do not label and don't have to label here genetically modified foods. There's
That's
a lot of issues right now. There's petitions that can be signed. I know the organics industry really would like to see that. I think most consumers would like that choice. We're not getting that choice either. So.
Right. Are there countries where genetically modified has to be labeled?
Europe, good parts of the UK, Italy, so certain areas over in Europe definitely label their food. So the consumer has a choice. 80% of our foods that we buy in the grocery store that are packaged have at least one genetically modified ingredient in them. So when we
That's
look at that,
astounding.
and we have no idea because it's not labeled, it may just say soy lecithin or cornstarch or high fructose corn syrup, all which come from genetically modified sources for the most part.
And we have no idea of knowing.
No.
Well, when we come back from the break, we'll be talking more about organic and local foods with Jacinda. Welcome back to Health Matters. We're talking about summer health. We've just been discussing eating locally and organically with nutritionist Jacinta Martin. So Jacinta, another thing I wanted to talk about, we covered a bit about organics and genetically modified. What about local? What does local eating mean, and why is that such a trend right now?
I think people are looking at going back to local. One, organics are expensive. Not everybody can afford organic foods. And then looking at the fact that we live in a very blessed area of Southern Ontario that has an immense variety of foods. Myself being from the Niagara region, we have such a variety of available fresh produce almost, for the length of the entire season of growing. So I think people are deciding that local is a better way to go. There is more options for us locally here to purchase foods. Some people would define local eating as the 50-mile radius. Others would say it's a 100-mile radius. I think really local can be defined from the individual based on what they feel is local. Perhaps local is down the road, so it does vary from person to person. But I think staying close to home, seasonal, trying to eat what is available during the season. If we look at years ago, we didn't eat in the middle of the winter the foods that we eat today.
That's true.
We ate what was available. So there is something to be said for seasonal eating and buying local at that point in time as well.
And I think people aren't aware that there are health issues from eating certain foods at the wrong times of the year. For instance, fruits are available when it's hot outside.
Yes, cooling
we eat
foods.
fruits when it's cold. We have more digestive issues with that, more yeast perhaps, stuff like that, and people aren't aware of that.
Yeah, there's a whole host of reasons why eating seasonal, health-wise, is very beneficial. Different cultures around the world follow that, very, very closely to eating specifically with what's in season. So
That's right. And I mean, the thing I think that we don't always realize is that plants have been here before us, and they've developed sort of the plant technology to survive the seasons, and we can absorb that by eating them, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right. And what are the benefits to eating local, maybe nutritionally, but also other benefits to it?
Well, I think we all have heard or talked about our carbon footprint. What are we leaving behind us?
Right.
What are the things that we do that affects the environment and everything that we participate in? And eating locally helps to participate in that in a positive way. The travel time for that food could be just your walk down the road, or could be to your local market, opposed to something that's driven or flown or shipped 20,000 kilometers or more to get to your local grocery store. So I think when we define fresh locally could be I picked it this morning and it's on my table at lunch.
Right.
But fresh coming from a grocer could be 5 days in the grocery store, 10 days of travel, and 3 days in your fridge. I'm not really sure how fresh that particularly would be. So our concept of fresh, I think, is a little distorted. Just because it looks and appears in the grocery store fresh doesn't mean it's fresh. Nutrient value is lost very quickly after it's picked, and the longer foods stay around, definitely we do lose nutrients. So.
And I know there's often a lot of waxes on things that keep them looking so beautiful despite the fact that they aren't truly so
Absolutely.
fresh.
We spray certain things with a liquid wax to keep the skin in a better form, shinier. All you have to do is stand back, I'm very bad for this, at the grocery store watching shoppers, and they will purchase and pick out the fruits that are the shiniest, not realizing that they've been waxed, or the fruits that are the orangest or the greenest, because they're drawn to the color, feeling it's a better choice, when actually some of them have been sprayed or dyed or injected. So again, consumer buyer beware type of thing. Yeah.
Wow, it's a lot to think about.
It is.
And now talking about, you mentioned our local markets. Are you aware of any markets in this area where we can be purchasing local food?
Yeah, there's a local market here at Square One, or in that Square One region, Farmers Market. It's open here on Fridays and Saturdays. If you're familiar with Peel, if your watchers are from Peel specifically, if you Google, I printed off here, I'm not from Peel, so there's Peel region, Grown in Peel, and it's Farm to You. So that it gives a list of all your local farmers, your local producers, grocers that carry organic foods. So there's a really, really good resource that way for your local people.
And there's so many local foods.
Absolutely.
We just have to find out how to get to them.
Absolutely.
And it's not that hard now.
No.
All right, another thing I wanted to talk about is labeling, and I think this is where a lot of consumers or lay people who don't have the time to go and do research on this get confused. So, what's the difference between free run and this and that and natural? Can you talk about that?
Sure, absolutely. The marketers for foods do a very good job. The consumer buys what we're told to buy.
Right.
So when we look at the free range eggs, we figure the birds have run freely and it's a better choice. When we look at the eggs themselves, are they a better, healthier choice? I'm not really sure. The birds have been not penned individually, which means that they have a free run. However, they're not running around loosely as people seem to think. When you go to an organic farmer, yes, you're probably going to see that more readily. There's not as many birds, not as overcrowded. So free run has a very what do I want to say, gray area as far as the actual definition of free run.
I think too it paints this picture of this beautiful, picturesque green farm where everything looks great, and you know we falsely believe that's where our food comes from, but
and
it's
even,
not the case.
Even free range cattle. So if we look at our meat being bought by free range, not organic but free range, yes, they're walking, but how much space do they have between each other? I think people have the concept where you can go out and pet the cows, and they're very well taken care of, and that's why it's important to go to your local farmer and really find out. You know, they may only have 100 head of cattle or 50 head of cattle that they take very good care of and treat well. So it's important, very different in the labeling on food products that we buy that way. Another one is vegetable fed or vegetarian fed that you'll often see on chicken, on eggs, and so on. Vegetarian fed could be corn, could be soy, could be all kinds of ingredients that are genetically modified possibly. So therefore, is it a healthier choice? Well, I guess that's for the consumer to decide. Holistically, from my perspective, no, it would need to be organic to ensure that it would be.
I mean, shouldn't they be eating vegetarian to begin with?
They should.
This is kind of a scary thing that we have to label it.
Yes.
I don't think cows are supposed to be eating other cows.
No, and also corn is not something that generally cows are supposed to eat. They're supposed to be grass eaters, and many of the animals are. So therefore, grass-fed is a much better diet for the cattle than corn and all these other ingredients.
It's the natural diet.
Absolutely.
And we're seeing these E. coli scares on the news now, and the fact is the E. coli doesn't come from the vegetable. It comes from the cows that are eating grains and things they shouldn't be eating, right?
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. So we've got lots of different bacterial issues as well. So I think staying close to home, staying local, understanding your labels. When something says all natural, again, Pam Spray has all natural written on it. There's nothing natural about Pam Spray. However, the ingredients that are in it being olive oil are considered all natural. So again, reading your label and understanding what it really truly means and who it's marketed to is very important when we're shopping.
And does anybody police these labels like natural? I mean, I know organic is in Canada, but is all natural or free range labels that are?
They fall within the guidelines of labeling rules for Canada, and Canada's food labeling guidelines themselves are somewhat vague, and there's a lot of loopholes that the producer of whatever the product is can sort of work its way to the consumer where they'll buy based on what they see. So again, it's not that it's not regulated, it falls within the regulations.
Right, and just to verify too, are organic meats or organic animals, are they free run? Is that part of the organic label?
It has to be. There's a whole set of protocol with meat. It is different than the crops that are grown.
Okay.
I'm not an organic farmer. However, I do know that there's lots of rules that they do have to follow.
Right.
And that's all easily found on the internet if an individual is looking to follow that or to make sure and ensure that those rules and regulations are there.
Right.
But in Canada, it is very difficult, and it's a lot of work for organic farmers, which also shows the cost, right? So it reflects the cost to the consumer because it is more care, more work.
Right, so this is probably why organics are so much more expensive. They can't raise as many cows in such a small space, right?
Yeah, right, absolutely.
Right. And you touched on things being flown from 20,000 kilometers away. Can you talk about the nutrient loss that happens with that? I mean, are we having as many nutrients in these foods if they're flown from halfway across the world? Well,
again, if we think about fresh and that concept of picked today, eaten today, or picked yesterday, eaten tomorrow kind of thing, or the time frame that it's taken to travel, one, the quality's gone down. Two, a lot of the products are picked early. So a lot of the products are picked, bananas for an example, many foods are picked early and ripened on their travels or helped to ripen quickly when they get to their destination. An example of tomatoes, they're picked early. Some of them are sprayed with an ethylene gas in order to ripen them quickly to make them red. Ethylene does happen naturally, however, but that in itself is a natural process and it's slow. So it's very different, and traveled food does lose quite a bit of nutrients. Yeah.
Right. And I've noticed too, tomatoes is such a great example. They don't smell like tomatoes anymore.
They don't taste like them either.
No, they don't.
No, not at all. Not at all.
So there's definitely something about growing your own tomatoes and that's fresh smell that I remember as a kid, which wasn't that long ago. Can you talk to us about gardening and is that becoming trendier now?
Absolutely. I think maybe the last 5 or 6 years, you're starting to see more and more people take part in local community gardens. You're seeing them plant gardens, even if they're just little pots on their patios with some fresh herbs and maybe a few tomato plants. I think people are becoming more and more aware of the quality of the food and finding out that, maybe a garden is the way to go.
Yeah.
One of my favorite writers, Michael Pollan, who writes the book Omnivore's Dilemma, or In the Defense of Food, he says people need to put more time or more money into better food. And it's so true. So I think with a busy society, we need to make that choice.
Right.
Are we going to fuel our bodies with better food? Therefore, growing that garden may be the best bet, right? So.
Right, and I think being a nutritionist and having counseled people, I find my clients in this area to be very reluctant on spending more money on food. And when you look at what Canadians spend on food versus Europeans, they spend a much higher percentage of their income on food. And it shows in their health. They have longer longevity, less risk of disease. So
people spend more money going through the Tim Hortons drive-through and the car wash than they do on their own food that goes into their body. So I find it really interesting, like you said, that people are not really willing to put the time and money into their own health. So I think our society has to make a shift. We have to make a change. And gardening, I think, is becoming that start, that change. And I know communities can learn from each other. There's such a multicultural group of people in Canada that if you join a community garden, you can learn about other countries' foods, other cultures' growth of certain vegetables that perhaps we don't grow here. So there's a lot to learn about food.
That's right. And I'm seeing so many more stores even selling herbs, even home stores. You can buy this plant kit, even Chapters selling, herbs that you can grow on your balcony. So
absolutely.
It's definitely becoming more accessible. We've only got a minute left, but perhaps very quickly you can tell us, is there a difference between frozen versus canned versus packaged? Which one's the best?
Well, I would say fresh based on local grown. However, if it's traveling 20,000 kilometers, I would go with local grown frozen foods.
Okay.
And
frozen.
Canned is probably the last.
Canned is the last,
That is
right.
the last, yeah.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Jacinta. You've really educated us today on different foods. That's it for this week. Come join us next week when we'll be talking about superfoods.